Hello again, I am Blunty, and today I want to look at Temtem, freshly launched out of early access and available on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 5 and Nintendo Switch. And of course with Temtem being quite obviously heavily inspired by Pokemon, and being a Pokemon-like game, pretty much everyone and anyone who loves this type of game and might be interested in Temtem will probably own a Nintendo Switch because, well, obviously that's the only place you can play Pokemon. Well, the new one, the modern games, you know what I mean. So, the natural question that follows is, with a multi-platform Pokemon-like game, is it worth owning on the home of Pokemon itself, the power-compromised Nintendo Switch console? And no, just before we dive in proper, it's not just a cheap and lazy Me Too copycat Pokemon clone. In fact, I have a whole video about how Temtem is actually better than Pokemon in some very interesting ways, in fact. So, give it a fair go before you dismiss it. Just because Game Freak didn't make it and just because the monsters you see on screen aren't familiar. But of course, the direct comparison to Pokemon is inescapable and very, very fair to make. So, before we look at Temtem on Switch versus the other platforms, let's get some context by looking at how it presents on Switch versus what Pokemon has been presenting on Switch recently. The most recent Pokemon release, of course, is Legends of Arceus, a game I really, really loved but hated to look at. And of course, with the even more broad and free-roaming Pokemon Violet and Scarlet coming in a few months. It's not true open world, but it's what we call open field, so it's not really a fair comparison, as Temtem doesn't have an open field style map design like Arceus. It's a little more linear. You know, there's exploratory stuff, but it's a little more linear like an older school Pokemon game. And of course, Temtem does not have a free camera like Arceus does, so let's move on from that because that demands very different things from the game engine, making this comparison, not entirely apples for apples. Pokemon Sword and Shield is a close comparison though, with most areas having a fixed camera, although it does dynamically change angle as you move through specific areas in this game. Stylistically and mechanically, it's a closer match, and I think it's fair to call Temtem nicer looking, don't you think? Or at least it presents cleaner and crisper. Their art styles are a bit different, so you may have a preference there. But, especially with things like the quality of the textures and the ground texture and the stuff in the rocks and whatnot, I think Temtem easily wins this side by side on first glance at least. And then of course you've got Pokemon Let's Go, which does have a crisper and cleaner art style, a little bit closer to Temtem's sort of artistic intent. And in fact, I do think Let's Go looks better than Temtem does. Of course, it's a little more limited in the way it presents, and Let's Go is a very, very, very dumbed down Pokemon experience designed for a new and very young player to get them on board with Pokemon. It's their first, baby's first Pokemon game. I mean, it's really fun, it's very cute and charming, but it is really, really dumbed down for a Pokemon game. And let's be fair, that's really, really not the target market for Temtem, so aside from a quick visual comparison, there's not really else worth comparing here. But now we can roll back to the main question, which is, of course, if you've the choice, how much compromise on graphics and performance are you making if you buy Temtem on Nintendo Switch so it can live alongside all your other modern Pokemon games? That's where you like to play those things. Is it worth getting Temtem there? Well, here it is on PC. And this is as good as this game can look. All the settings are turned up and maxed out and whatnot, and this is as good as it can run. I'm on an RTX 3080 Ti with a 3900X 24-thread CPU. It's installed on a Gen 4 PCIe M.2 drive, and it's running at 4K, and I've got it manually locked down to 60 FPS. This is the ideal experience, basically. And I know what you're about to say. Hey, Blunty, come on, Blunty, come on. That's hardly a fair comparison, comparing the Switch to that beast of a PC. And yeah, no shit, Sherlock, it's not supposed to be a fair comparison. That's not the point I'm making here. I'm trying to make the point of just how much compromise is possible from the absolute best this game looks to the Nintendo Switch, without, deliberately dumbing down on the PC side. But also, just give me a couple of minutes here, because I do have a PC 1080p versus Switch 1080p comparison to show you, which is a little closer to apples for apples, if you like. And the 4K PC version here will also be basically identical to the Xbox Series X and S and PS5 versions too. All of those run at 4K 60 FPS as well, although there might be some slight differences in the quality of things like the shadow and the reflections and whatnot. But for all practical purposes, my PC comparison here is everything else versus the Switch. Now, according to the developers themselves, the Nintendo Switch version runs with a dynamic resolution targeting 1080p 30 FPS. According to my human eyeballs, it's rarely reaching 1080p, and that 30 FPS target is let's choose the word elusive. Oh, it can, will, and in fact does run at 30 FPS quite a lot of the time, but stable is not a word I would choose to use to describe that 30 FPS. It varies wildly and suffers a lot of stuttering and hitching with some god-awful frame pacing to go alongside it. Luckily, the game isn't actually action-based in anything it does, well, outside of a few movement-based puzzles around the place, but for the most part this is only a hindrance to aesthetics and not to actual gameplay mechanics. And to be fair and clear, even on my monster gaming PC the game also hitches up quite frequently too, which mostly happens in area transitions I've noticed, and I suspect that's because of the underlying server sharding at work, silently moving you from slice to slice on the server as you move through different areas, and it loads in different batches of other players. This is of course essential and something that pretty much every other MMO on the planet does these days, because showing every single player in one cohesive instance all at once would be nightmarish and make it unplayable, not just from the potential for crowding and not being able to, see anything for the bobbing of heads, but also of course performance. It would just tank performance on pretty much any platform. So, not all of the hitching and stuttering lays at the feet of the rapidly aging hardware of the Nintendo Switch, which, it launched with already out-of-date last-generation NVIDIA chipsets, which was a little bit frustrating at the time and continues to be, but it kind of comes with the territory on the Switch, doesn't it? We've accepted that at this point, right? And I've no intention of pixel counting like a fusspot to figure out exactly what resolutions it's running at in any area, but if I had to make a guesstimate, just based on, squishy human eyeballs and 4 decades of gaming experience, I'd say the game is mostly running at about 900p-ish in docked mode. And to demonstrate how easy that is to spot, here is that 1080p on PC versus 1080p on Switch comparison I teased you about. So as you hopefully will be able to see, give or take YouTube's compression, the difference between a true 1080p experience and a dynamic 1080p experience, well, on paper it doesn't sound all that dramatic, does it? In practice, of course, it's an easy spot, at least for me, especially on a big screen or a computer monitor, a meter in front of your face, as is how I play most of my games. And by now, I'm sure you've also noticed the other compromises that Switch had to make to get the game running. The absolute lack of a lot of lighting effects, for example. There's no dynamic shadows at all. Screen space reflections are entirely missing. Even environmental animation details like the ripples in the water when you're standing or running through it. They're not there on the Switch. The models and textures of the environment, especially things like the grass patches, are basically just mush on the Switch too, which is a little bit unfortunate. But again, to be fair, that's something that Pokemon also suffers from, especially for Arceus and things like that, which had notoriously mushy textures. Load times are another obvious difference, of course, as well. Although, by nature of it being an MMO, there's some server stuff going on under the hood when you move areas, like I was talking about before. And so even on PC, that stuff can make load times a bit variable as it tries to latch onto a different server slice or whatever it's doing under there. So even from the world's fastest NVMe drive like I'm burning from, load times are a bit variable. That said, of course, yes, of course, the Switch load times are always slower. Now, it's not hugely slower most of the time. I mean, it does stack up sometimes. And again, the game design really doesn't rely on fast loads, so it's a very slight inconvenience to your personal time management, I suppose. It doesn't actually impact gameplay in any way at any time. So it's worth noting, as people have asked me about it when I was live streaming this yesterday, but it's not an issue I'd put on a pros and cons list, frankly. It doesn't actually matter that much, aside from being slightly annoying. Now, all of that said, for the most part, especially if you're not switching between platforms as I have been, going from one extreme to the other, from Nintendo Switch to a monster PC, you do get used to the Switch version pretty quickly. By now, Switch owners, we know we're compromising. It's hardly a rude shock, but between the Switch's superb first-party offerings and, of course, the convenience and its flexibility of console, handheld, yada yada yada, most Switch owners don't whine too much, or at least for too long, about the shittier graphics we pay for in exchange for those various other conveniences and niceties. Do we wish the Switch was more powerful? Of course we do. But you take what you get. For me, I have no buyer's remorse for the Switch version. In fact, just last night, it came in absolutely clutch and saved me from absolute devastating boredom, because I had a blackout. So there I was, sitting in the pitch black, at night, and a cold night, no less. So I snatched up my Switch Lite, climbed into bed, got all snuggly, jammed my phone's data into hotspot mode, connected the console, and played a couple of hours worth of Temtem in the dark while I waited for the power to come back on. And it worked. beautifully. And outside of some of the UI's text being a bit hard to read, with tired eyes especially, I suppose, between the less demanding native 720 screen it has in handheld mode and the smaller size of the screen on the Switch Lite especially, Temtem presents really, really nicely in handheld mode. I mean, it still has all the same performance issues pretty much, and it still runs at a dynamic resolution, so it's not even, locked at 720p. It'll fall below that here and there. But it is very playable in handheld mode, which is mostly why I wanted it on Switch personally myself anyway, because of course, anytime I'm big screening it or playing for long sessions, I will of course be using my PC because, well, why wouldn't I? It looks awesome. But for short bursts of play, the lack of friction of just being able to turn on the Switch or pick up the Switch or whatever, I'm going to play it there for the short burst stuff. And of course, for the handheld stuff, and any more blackouts I might have to have, I like having it on the Switch. But that said, of course, no. If you've got the choice, if you've got the hardware to make the choice, and maybe you don't care about handheld mode at all or very little, I would certainly suggest getting it on PC, Xbox, or PlayStation 5 as a first choice, and in that order as well. Because PC, of course, online is free. You've got more flexibility in how to set it up and how it runs and whatnot. On Xbox, well, their online service in the form of Game Pass is tremendously fantastic value. So anyone who's got an Xbox probably has Game Pass anyway, for the most part. So there's no extra cost involved. And while Temtem on the PS5 looks and plays great by all reports, today's PlayStation Plus offerings, which you will need, of course, for online play, are just absolutely lousy value. Just like absolute shit value. Sony just, I don't even know what Sony tried to do with their latest reboot of PlayStation Plus, but they effed it up. They effed it up big time. It's horrible. Your opinions may vary. Anyway, hopefully this has been helpful, informative, interesting, or any of the above, all of the above preference. And if it is, it has been, I need to beg you at this point to comment, like, subscribe, bell, and scream hopelessly into the void at the YouTube machine mind, which continuously punishes my channel. I'm still getting messages from people saying, I've been subscribed to you for like a decade and YouTube just don't suggest your videos to me anymore. Well, please help me do something about that by doing the interactive things. I hate having to ask for this. I really, truly hate it, but please just help a little bit, please. Help, please. Thank you, by the way, for the help and assistance and support of the patrons who are now scrolling up above there. Their above and support is fantastic, and thank you for the rest of you for watching the entire video, I guess, because that helps too. Even if you don't do the other stuff, just watching the entire video, watch time matters. And can you tell I'm a bit frustrated with YouTube these days? Can you tell? Is it coming through? Thanks for watching. I'm Blondie. We'll catch you next time.